In 2022, forensic pathologists documented two unrelated deaths. Both people had burned something containing poison ivy, and in both cases, urushiol carried in the smoke was tied to cardiopulmonary arrest. Most people learn a smaller rule about this plant. Leaves of 3, let it be, a warning about staying far enough away. This year, wildfire smoke made headlines again, as smoke from Canadian wildfires pushed air quality in New York, Boston, and Chicago among the worst in the world, though nothing ties those specific fires to poison ivy. Still, as a thought experiment, fires at that scale moving through the dense poison ivy of the eastern and central United States could release far more urushiol than anything seen so far. A plausible scenario, not a claim about what is happening in Canada now. If channels like this interest you, subscribing helps. The real question is whether those two deaths were a freak accident or the first visible edge of something that grows with every longer fire season. That childhood rule, leaves of 3, let it be, is worth sitting with for a moment because of what it quietly assumes. It assumes the danger stays where you can see it, contained inside the plant, waiting for your hand or your ankle to make contact. It is a rule about your eyes and your hands. It has worked, more or less, for generations, and it has shaped almost everything public health guidance says about this plant. The American Academy of Dermatology estimates that somewhere between 10 million and 50 million Americans develop an allergic skin reaction to poison ivy, poison oak, or poison sumac every single year, making it one of the most common causes of allergic contact reactions in the country. Every piece of public health guidance built around the plant assumes the same thing. Avoid contact, wash your skin. Do not let the oil, called urushiol, sit on your clothing or your tools. The Centers for Disease Control's occupational safety arm, NIOSH, warns outdoor workers specifically about this family of plants, and the guidance is almost entirely about skin exposure, protective clothing, and washing procedures. There is one line, though, that sits slightly apart from the rest of that guidance, and it has been there for years without drawing much attention. Poison control centers explicitly warn people never to burn poison ivy because doing so releases urushiol into the air and can cause severe lung reactions, not just skin ones. Firefighters and forest management personnel, the guidance notes, frequently develop reactions to urushiol carried by smoke particles. For most of the public, that line reads as a footnote. For the small number of people whose job puts them near burning brush piles or wildland fires, it has always meant something closer to an occupational hazard. That gap between the rule people actually learn and the rule the science was quietly building toward is exactly where this story lives. And it is exactly what the 2022 forensic report exposed. The report, published in the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology, described what the authors called the first documented cases of death directly tied to poison ivy smoke inhalation. In both instances, someone burned material containing the plant. In both instances, the exposure led to cardiopulmonary arrest, and the history, circumstances, and autopsy findings were all consistent with urushiol smoke inhalation having caused or contributed to death. The authors were explicit about how rare it is for this compound to affect organ systems beyond the skin, which is exactly why two independent, unrelated deaths were significant enough to publish. Two deaths, on their own, could be dismissed as tragic outliers. But the pattern widens once you look past individual case reports and into the population most regularly exposed to wildfire smoke for a living. During the Soberaney's fire, which burned through the Big Sur area of California in 2016, CAL FIRE recorded over 415 cases of poison oak exposure among the more than 5,000 personnel deployed to the incident. A public health physician working with Santa Cruz County at the time noted plainly that while most cases stayed on the skin, the real concern was what happened if urushiol reached the lungs. Poison oak is a close relative of poison ivy. Same genus, same oily compound, same mechanism of harm, and the numbers from that single fire show how quickly an isolated risk becomes a mass occupational event, once enough people are working inside smoke for long enough. That is not an isolated statistic either. Firefighting organizations describe reactions to urushiol-bearing plants, poison ivy, poison oak, and poison sumac together as one of the leading causes of lost work time and disability claims within the profession. Researchers tracking forestry and wildland labor estimate that in a typical fire season, roughly a third of forestry workers across California, Oregon, and Washington are temporarily disabled by poison oak dermatitis alone, a figure that only counts visible skin reactions and says nothing about how many of those same workers were also breathing urushiol-laden smoke without anyone testing for it. Smoke jumpers and wildland crews are considered especially vulnerable because their work puts them directly inside the smoke plumes rising from vegetation that, in large parts of the country, includes exactly the plant most people think they only need to worry about on a hiking trail. What makes that vulnerability harder to manage is that the standard tools of fire protection were never built with this specific hazard in mind. Public health researchers who study wildfire firefighting equipment are blunt about the gap. Wildfire smoke is treated as a workplace exposure, but no respirator currently exists that is both certified for the extreme heat and physical demands of fireline work and able to filter every hazardous component the smoke contains. Standard air purifying respirators can reduce the particulate matter that carries urushiol, but they do nothing against the gases mixed into the same smoke. And heavier, fully sealed masks are often impractical during hours of strenuous work in dangerous heat. For most of the history of wildland firefighting, this was not a matter of technology, but of policy. For decades, federal wildland firefighters were simply not permitted to wear respirators on the fire line at all, regardless of what protection might have been available, according to reporting on the Forest Service's own history of the practice. Awareness of the long-term cost of that policy grew slowly, then more formally, after the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2023 directed federal agencies to engage more seriously with wildland firefighter health, eventually leading to an official, presumptive list of cancers and illnesses considered connected to the occupation. That shift culminated in a 2026 wildfire readiness memo from the Secretary of Agriculture, which finally authorized federal wildland firefighters to use N95 respirators on the fire line for the first time, following required training. Officials were careful to describe it as an interim measure rather than a solution. Even a properly fitted N95, worn on a clean-shaven face with a successful fit test, filters out only around 95% of airborne particles, not the gases also present in smoke. And the guidance restricts its use to lower-intensity tasks like mop-up, cold trailing, patrol, and staging, rather than direct attack, firing operations, or any work near open flame, where heat and exertion make a sealed mask both less effective and more dangerous to wear. Alongside the N95 authorization, officials also announced a parallel decontamination program. Since inhalation was never the only route of exposure, the new protocols call for expanded access to showers, routine cleaning of gear and vehicle cabs, and dedicated clean air recovery periods built into fire assignments, with firefighters now paid for the time that decontamination takes. The reasoning behind pairing the two measures is straightforward. Urushiol does not just ride in on smoke inhaled through the nose and mouth. It also settles on skin, clothing, and equipment in exactly the way patent literature on the compound describes, which means a mask alone was never going to be a complete answer. In practice, this means that for most of firefighting history, and still for a great deal of it today, the people spending the most hours inside urushiol-laden smoke have had the least practical ability to filter it out of the air they breathe. Picture a wildland engine crew working mop-up along the edge of a fire that was contained days earlier, exactly the kind of lower-intensity task the new N95 guidance was written for. The smoke here is thinner than it was during active suppression, more of a lingering haze than a wall, drifting low over blackened ground, still warm enough to feel through the soles of their boots. The crew moves through scorched brush, checking for hidden embers, the air tasting faintly of char and something sharper underneath it. Tangled among the burned understory are the unmistakable, now charred vines of poison ivy, indistinguishable at a glance from any other blackened branch underfoot. Someone turns over a smoldering root mass to check it for heat, and a thin ribbon of smoke lifts past their face before drifting off into the trees. There is no way to know, in that moment, how much urushiol that particular curl of smoke is carrying, or whether it is enough to matter. Nobody stops to ask. The work continues, because it always has. Which raises the harder question. It is one thing to accept that this happens. It is another to explain how a compound famous for causing an itchy rash on contact can travel through the air and put someone into cardiac arrest. That mechanism is worth understanding on its own, because it is the piece that turns an occupational curiosity into something anyone standing near a burning brush pile should actually think about. None of this requires imagining some exotic, undiscovered process. It comes down to a fairly simple physical fact about the compound itself. Urushiol is not a gas. On its own, it does not become airborne the way something volatile like gasoline vapor would. What patent documentation on urushiol removal describes, and what fire safety literature confirms, is that the oil clings to ash and dust particles and rides along inside the tiny droplets suspended in smoke. Burning does not destroy urushiol so much as it disperses it, carried on particulate matter that can travel well beyond the fire itself and settle in places, including someone's eyes and lungs, that the plant itself never could have reached. Once those particles are inhaled, the body responds to urushiol in the lungs the same way it responds to urushiol on skin. This is a delayed hypersensitivity reaction, the same immune mechanism behind a poison ivy rash, except now it is happening inside airway tissue instead of on the surface of skin. The result, doctors describe, is a kind of chemical pneumonitis, inflammation and irritation deep inside the respiratory tract, with symptoms ranging from painful breathing and throat swelling to, in the most severe and thankfully rare documented cases, respiratory failure. Medical literature on chemical pneumonitis in general, the broader category of lung injury this exposure falls under, describes a fairly consistent pattern regardless of which irritant is involved. Symptoms often begin within minutes to hours of exposure, starting with coughing, a burning sensation in the throat, and tightness in the chest. And in milder cases, they may not fully surface for a day or two afterward. Treatment, in the great majority of cases, is supportive rather than dramatic. Rest, hydration, monitoring, and staying away from any further exposure to the irritant. In more severe presentations, physicians add supplemental oxygen, bronchodilators to help open airways that have started to swell shut, and sometimes corticosteroids to calm the underlying inflammatory reaction. In the rare, most severe cases, patients may need hospitalization and temporary mechanical ventilation while their lungs recover. Because urushiol-specific inhalation injuries are so uncommon, there is no dedicated treatment protocol built just for this exposure. Doctors instead fall back on the same supportive framework used for chemical pneumonitis caused by any irritant, which is itself part of why poison control guidance is so direct about the instruction to seek emergency care immediately. If breathing difficulty follows exposure to burning poison ivy, rather than waiting to see how symptoms develop. A 2024 review published in the journal focused on allergy and immunology, part of a special collection examining wildfire smoke and airway disease, explicitly names urushiol from burning poison oak, poison ivy, and poison sumac as one of the plant-derived irritants capable of triggering that kind of allergic airway response when carried in wildfire smoke. This is the point where the childhood rule stops applying cleanly. Leaves of 3, Let It Be was built entirely around direct contact, around a plant staying still long enough for a hand or an ankle to find it. Once urushiol is riding on smoke particles instead of sitting on a leaf, the entire premise of the rule quietly falls apart. You do not need to touch the plant. You do not even need to see it. You only need to be downwind of something that once contained it, burning. But even this mechanism comes with an honest limit, and it is worth stating plainly rather than smoothing over. Researchers do not know exactly how much urushiol needs to be present in smoke to trigger a severe reaction, or why some exposed people, including many firefighters who breathe wildfire smoke for entire careers, never develop anything beyond a mild throat irritation, while a small number of documented cases end in cardiac arrest. The compound's effect on the lungs is real and medically documented, but the dose, the individual sensitivity, and the exact threshold for danger remain genuinely unresolved. That gap in the science is not a flaw in the reporting. It is the honest edge of what is currently known, and it is exactly what keeps this from being a simple, closed case. That uncertainty around dose and threshold connects to something else worth understanding: where and when the plant carrying that risk is actually present. Eastern poison ivy, Toxicodendron radicans, the form most people picture when they hear the name, grows across virtually the entire eastern half of the country. It is present in nearly every state east of the Rocky Mountains, with poison ivy in some form, largely absent only from California, Alaska, and Hawaii. A related form, sometimes called Rydberg's poison ivy, extends the plant's range through much of the rest of North America outside the deep southeast. Between the two, some version of poison ivy grows in nearly every part of the continental United States. It is not seasonal the way a flowering plant is. Urushiol is present in the leaves, the stems, and the roots year-round, and it stays chemically active even after the plant has dropped its leaves for winter, which is why cleared brush piles and firewood collected months earlier can still cause a reaction. Clinical references on the plant note that as its leaves change color in autumn, they can accumulate even higher concentrations of urushiol than they carried during the height of summer growth, meaning a vine that looks least dangerous, faded, brittle, dying back for the year, may in fact be holding some of the most concentrated oil it produces all year. That detail matters for one specific reason. It overlaps almost exactly with the back half of wildfire season across much of North America, the same stretch of the calendar when both the volume of dry, burnable plant material and, potentially, its urushiol content are at their highest at once. That gap becomes even more important once you widen the lens from individual exposure to the bigger picture, because there are two separate, credible explanations for why this danger seems to be surfacing now, and neither one fully explains the pattern on its own. The first explanation is systemic, and it has real research behind it. A 6-year study conducted at Duke University exposed forest plots to elevated carbon dioxide levels, roughly what the atmosphere is projected to reach later this century, and found that poison ivy increased its biomass by 67%, more than any other species measured in the study. Researchers, including ecologist Jacqueline Mohan at the University of Georgia and plant physiologist Louis Ziska, found something else alongside that growth. Higher carbon dioxide levels favored production of a more allergenic form of urushiol, meaning the plant is not just spreading and thickening under a changing climate, it may be becoming more potent at the same time. Layer that finding onto wildfire seasons that are documented to be growing longer, more intense, and more widespread across North America, and you have a plausible, measurable convergence. More poison ivy, more toxic poison ivy, burning inside more frequent and larger fires. The second explanation is muddier, and it has nothing to do with the plant changing at all. It is about recognition. The 2022 forensic report describes itself, explicitly, as documenting the first known cases of death tied to poison ivy smoke inhalation. That phrase cuts two different ways. It could mean this is a genuinely new and growing danger. It could just as easily mean that forensic pathology only recently developed the tools and awareness to correctly attribute a death to urushiol smoke exposure, and that similar deaths in past decades may simply have been recorded as ordinary smoke inhalation or unexplained cardiac events, with nobody ever testing for the specific cause. Better diagnosis produces the exact same rise in documented cases that a genuinely worsening danger would produce. And from the outside, those two patterns look identical. Neither explanation can be ruled out, and neither one fully accounts for what the evidence shows on its own. It may not be a question of which explanation is correct. It may be that both are happening at once, in a proportion nobody has measured, and, given how rare and hard to study these cases are, may not be measurable for years. In fact, those two explanations do not have to compete with each other at all. They may be feeding the same trend from opposite directions. A warming climate is producing more vigorous, more toxic poison ivy at the same time it is producing longer, more frequent, more intense wildfire seasons. Exactly the conditions that would generate more smoke exposure events, regardless of whether anyone was watching closely enough to record them. At the same moment, medical awareness of urushiol as a respiratory hazard, rather than purely a skin one, has only recently caught up enough for forensic pathologists to name it correctly when it does happen. A rising underlying danger and a rising ability to detect that danger can climb together, each one making the other more visible, without either one being the whole story on its own. Go back to where this started. Two people, in two separate and unrelated incidents, burned something containing poison ivy and did not survive the smoke. At the time, there was no reason for either of them to think of that fire as anything more dangerous than an ordinary backyard task. The rule they almost certainly knew, leaves of 3, let it be, had nothing to say about smoke, about distance, about the air itself carrying what they had spent their whole lives being taught to simply step around. That rule was never really about a plant. It was about a boundary. A line between safe and unsafe that depended entirely on staying far enough away and never making contact. Wildfire smoke quietly erases that boundary, carrying what used to require touch into the air itself, sometimes for miles, long after the leaves that produced it have burned away entirely. This past summer, as smoke from Canadian wildfires drifted across the Northeast and Midwest again, turning skylines in cities like New York and Chicago the color of rust for days at a time, millions of people stood outside and looked up at air they had no way to fully read. Most of that smoke had nothing to do with poison ivy at all, and nothing here claims otherwise. But somewhere within a much smaller, much more specific set of fires, in backyards and brush piles and wildland containment lines across the country, the plant that most people still think only threatens the skin was doing something the rule never prepared anyone for, quietly and almost entirely unseen.